She didn't cry. Not one tear. Not when Jonathan Pierce announced before 100 guests that their engagement was over. Not when the crowd fell silent and stared. Not when she pulled that ring from her finger and pressed it back into his palm, without a single word. Abigail Carter lifted her chin, turned, and walked away. Because a woman who knows her worth doesn't beg. She doesn't plead. She leaves. And then the black carriage stopped. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who didn't deserve you, stay until the end. Subscribe to our channel. Drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1818 arrived in Virginia, the way it always did, heavy with heat, thick with the smell of honeysuckle, and draped in the particular kind of genteel cruelty that only polite society could manufacture with such precision. The Whitmore estate sat just outside Richmond, its wide wraparound porch lit by 100 lanterns, its ballroom swollen with the laughter and whispers of Virginia's finest families. Silk gowns swept the floorboards. Crystal glasses clinked. And somewhere beneath all that brightness, Abigail Carter stood near the east window and felt for reasons she could not yet name that something was very wrong. She had felt it since morning. Jonathan had been distant at breakfast, not unusual for a man who wore charm like a second coat and only put it on when company was watching. He had kissed her hand when he arrived at the estate, smiled that practiced smile of his, and said she looked lovely. But his eyes had moved past her before the words were even finished. She had told herself it was nerves. Engaged men got nervous. That was natural. She had been telling herself a great many things that weren't true for the past 2 years. The ballroom hummed and turned around her, and Abigail kept her posture straight, her expression composed the way her mother had taught her. A Carter woman does not let her face betray her heart, not in public, not ever. She was 22 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning exactly how to stand in a room full of people and feel completely, utterly alone. Jonathan found her near the window at 9:30. He looked the way he always did when he had decided something that particular, set to his jaw, that almost smile, that never quite committed to warmth. He was 31 years old and handsome, in the way that a painting is handsome, impressive from a distance, cold up close. He took her hand, turned it over, and then did not meet her eyes. "Abigail," he said, and his voice carried just far enough that the two nearest couples turned their heads. "We need to speak." "Then speak," she said quietly. He cleared his throat. Around them the music continued for exactly 3 more measures, and then the quartet trailed off. Not because anyone told them to stop, but because the silence between Jonathan Pierce and Abigail Carter had a weight that pulled everything else down with it. "I think," he began, loud enough now that she understood this was not a private conversation. It had never been meant to be private. "That we have both come to understand that our arrangement no longer serves either of us well." Abigail did not move. She heard the intake of breath from the woman to her left. She heard someone murmur Jonathan's name in low warning. She looked at him, really looked at him, and waited. "I believe it would be best," he continued, and she could see now that he had rehearsed this, had stood before a mirror somewhere, and practiced the exact angle of regret on his face. "If we were to dissolve our engagement, quietly, with mutual understanding." The room had gone completely still. Abigail Carter heard her own heartbeat. She heard the distant sound of a carriage on the road outside. She heard the creak of floorboards as the nearest guests shifted their weight toward the spectacle. And she made a decision not in that moment, but in every moment before it that had been quietly building toward this one. And the decision was simply this: she would not give him the satisfaction of watching her break. "Mutually," she repeated. "I think it's for the best," he said, again softer now, as though softness would make the public humiliation feel more like kindness. "We want different things, Abigail. You must understand that." "I understand perfectly," she said. Her voice did not shake. Her hands were perfectly still as she reached up, removed the glove from her right hand, one finger at a time, then slid the engagement ring, a modest pearl and gold piece that his mother had chosen and she had never loved, from her finger. She held it for exactly 1 breath. Then she placed it in his open palm, closed his fingers around it with both her hands, and looked him in the eye. "I wish you well, Mr. Pierce," she said. Then she stepped back, turned, and walked across the ballroom floor toward the main entrance. Every eye in the room followed her. No one spoke. Her heels were steady on the floorboards. Her breathing was controlled. And somewhere between the east window and the front door, Abigail Carter understood with absolute clarity that the only thing worse than being publicly humiliated was letting anyone see that it had touched her. She made it to the front steps before her hands began to shake. The night air hit her face warm and heavy and smelling of cut grass, and she stood at the top of the Whitmore steps and breathed. Below her, the gravel drive curved away into the dark. The family carriage was somewhere around back, and she needed to find it, needed to get inside. It needed to be somewhere that was not here before the composure she'd stitched together in that ballroom came entirely apart. She was halfway down the steps when the sound reached her. Hooves, steady and deliberate, not the shuffling of a waiting team, the purposeful rhythm of a carriage arriving. She stopped. A black coach rolled up the long drive, its 4 horses dark and well kept, the lacquered sides catching the lantern light. It moved without hurry, the way expensive things always moved, and it pulled to a stop directly at the base of the front steps, directly in front of her. The driver descended and opened the door before she had time to step aside. "Miss Carter." The man, the driver, gray-coated and formal, looked up at her without any of the pity she'd been absorbing for the past 10 minutes. "Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne requests the honor of a moment of your time." The name hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Nathaniel Hawthorne. She had not said that name aloud in 3 years. She had not allowed herself to think it too carefully because thinking it carefully led to remembering things she had decided not to remember. The way he had looked at her across a room, not with the theatrical devotion Jonathan always performed, but with something quieter and far more frightening. The way he had told her once simply and without drama that he believed she was worth more than she was currently willing to ask for. The way she had laughed it off, the way he had not. She had turned him away 3 years ago, politely, firmly. And then she had accepted Jonathan Pierce's engagement 6 months later because Jonathan was charming and attentive and said all the right things, and she had told herself that was enough. She was standing at the bottom of a social ruin of her own making, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's carriage was sitting 10 feet in front of her. She descended the remaining steps. Behind her, she could hear the front doors of the Whitmore estate opening, guests spilling out onto the porch drawn by curiosity and the particular appetite that polite society develops for other people's disasters. She heard Jonathan's voice among them, sharp with something that might have been surprise. She did not look back. She walked to the carriage door. The driver offered his hand and she took it. She stepped inside. Nathaniel Hawthorne was exactly as she remembered him, which was to say, he was nothing like what she remembered because memory had softened him into something easier to dismiss. He was broader across the shoulders than she recalled. Older in the face, 36 now, with lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. He was dressed plainly for a man of his standing, no decoration, no performance. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who had never needed a room to look at him in order to feel settled in his own skin. He did not stand when she entered. He did not make a production of her arrival. He simply met her eyes and said with no preamble at all, "Are you all right?" Abigail sat down across from him. The carriage door closed. She could hear the murmuring of the crowd on the steps outside, and she was acutely aware that every person still standing on that porch was watching this coach and drawing conclusions. She was also aware in some distant and functional part of her mind that she did not particularly care. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to be," he said. "I know that. Then I'll ask again." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her the way she had forgotten anyone had ever looked at her, like the answer actually mattered. "Are you all right?" Abigail pressed her lips together. Outside, someone on the porch laughed a sharp social sound. She recognized the voice. It belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, who had always found other women's misfortunes very entertaining. "I have been better." Abigail said at last. That's honest. He sat back. I appreciate honest. What are you doing here, Mr. Hawthorne? She kept her voice even. You haven't been in Virginia in 3 years, he said. I know. Then why tonight? He was quiet for a moment. The carriage had not moved. She noticed that. They were simply sitting in the drive, while the whole of Virginia's upper class watched from the porch and whispered. A less composed woman might have demanded they drive away immediately. But Abigail had spent the last half hour being watched, and she found she had run out of the particular energy required to perform discomfort. I had business in Richmond, Nathaniel said. I arrived this afternoon, and I was told... He paused. I heard about tonight, about what Pierce was planning. Her chin came up slightly. And you came to witness it? No. There was no apology in his voice, but there was no defensiveness either. Just the simple weight of a man telling the truth. I came because I thought you might need a way out of that room that didn't require you to walk alone. I was managing. You were, he agreed readily. Better than anyone had a right to expect. He glanced out the carriage window briefly. But there's managing, and then there's not having to manage alone. Those are different things. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light inside the carriage caught the line of his jaw, the steadiness in his expression. He had not touched her. He had not offered platitudes. He had not told her she deserved better, or that Jonathan was a fool, or any of the performed sympathy she would hear for the next 3 weeks from everyone she knew. He had simply come. And then he had asked if she was all right. She felt something shift in the back of her throat that she refused to let become anything it couldn't be taken back. People are watching, she said. I know. This will cause talk. It will, he said without a trace of concern. You don't seem troubled by that. I've never found other people's opinions to be a reliable guide to my own decisions, he said. You may feel differently. I'll have the driver take you home if that's what you'd prefer. No one will say a word about it. Abigail looked down at her hands. The ring finger of her right hand was bare now, and she was aware of its absence, the way you are aware of a tooth that has been pulled, not with grief exactly, but with the strange hollow recognition of something that was there and is no longer. Who told you, she asked, about tonight? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. A beat. Then, Thomas Alcott, he's a solicitor. He does work for both my family and your father's. He came to me this afternoon. He was worried. Nathaniel's jaw tightened very slightly. He said Pierce has been negotiating privately for the past 2 months with the Hargrove family, their daughter. She comes with considerably more land than you do. The words landed with the particular flatness of something she had suspected but not allowed herself to confirm. Ah, she said. Abigail. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it was quiet, not familiar, not presumptuous, but careful. Like a man stepping forward on uncertain ground, making sure it would hold. What he did tonight was not a reflection of your worth. I want to say that plainly, because I suspect the next several weeks are going to be full of people saying it in ways that make it about him. It is not about him. It is about you. And you are worth considerably more than anything Jonathan Pierce ever offered you. She did not answer for a long moment. You always said things directly, she finally said. I find it saves time. It can also be quite alarming. I'll take that as progress, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the intention of one. Despite everything, despite the humiliation still radiating through the evening behind her, despite the bare finger and the watching crowd and the hollow chest she was carrying around, Abigail felt something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it, move through her. You drove here this evening, she said, knowing what was happening, knowing I might refuse to speak with you, knowing the entire county would see. Yes. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because 3 years ago, I walked away without saying what I should have said. And I decided I wasn't going to do that twice. The silence between them settled. Outside, the crowd on the Whitmore porch had not dispersed. Someone was calling for Jonathan. Someone else was laughing that same sharp social laugh. The summer night pressed warm against the carriage windows, and the lanterns swayed slightly in the breeze coming up from the river. Abigail thought about the ring she had pressed back into Jonathan's hand. She thought about the careful, practiced look on his face when he'd said, "We want different things." She thought about 2 years of telling herself that attentive was the same as faithful and charming was the same as trustworthy, and beautiful words were the same as a man who actually meant them. She thought about the way Nathaniel Hawthorne had just said, "I wasn't going to do that twice," with no dramatics and no performance and no expectation that she would respond in any particular way. "Take me home, Mr. Hawthorne," she said at last. "Yes, ma'am." He knocked twice on the carriage wall. The team moved forward, and as the coach rolled away from the Whitmore estate and down the long gravel drive, Abigail Carter did not look back at the people still gathered on the porch. She looked straight ahead, hands folded in her lap, spine straight, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to breathe. She did not yet know what any of this meant. She did not know what Nathaniel Hawthorne's presence in her life was going to cost her, or what it was going to ask of her, or whether she was prepared to answer. She did not know that Jonathan Pierce was already moving back through the ballroom with cold calculations running behind his eyes, already measuring what her association with Nathaniel represented, already planning the particular kind of damage that vain and cornered men always plan when they realize they may have underestimated what they were throwing away. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that the night air was warm and the carriage was quiet, and the man sitting across from her had come not to save her, not to claim her, not to make her humiliation into his opportunity, but simply to make sure she did not have to stand alone in it. And for the first time all evening, Abigail Carter felt something settle in her chest that felt, in spite of everything, like the very distant beginning of solid ground. The carriage ride back to Carterlands took 40 minutes, and Nathaniel Hawthorne did not fill a single one of them with noise. That was the thing Abigail noticed first: the silence. Not the uncomfortable kind that demanded filling, not the loaded kind that required careful navigation. Just silence settled, and undemanding, the way a man sits in a room when he has nothing to prove, and nowhere more important to be. He looked out the window occasionally. He did not watch her. He did not offer comfort she hadn't asked for. When they reached the end of the Carter Drive, he stepped out first and offered his hand to help her down. She took it. His grip was firm and brief, and he released her the moment her feet were on solid ground. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Miss Carter," he said. And that was all. She walked to her front door without looking back. But she heard the carriage stay until she was inside. Heard the horses shift and wait. Heard the wheels finally turn and move away, only after the door had closed behind her. She stood in the entryway of her family home in the dark, and pressed one hand flat against the wood of the door and breathed. Her mother found her there 3 minutes later. Margaret Carter was 51 years old and had survived the death of a husband, 2 failed harvests, and a society that had opinions about everything a woman did or failed to do. She came down the stairs in her dressing gown, a single candle in her hand, and took one look at her daughter's face and said nothing at all. She simply put her arm around Abigail's shoulders and walked her toward the sitting room. And that silence, like Nathaniel's in its own way, was the kindest thing anyone had offered her all evening. It was only when they were seated, only when the candle was set on the table between them, and the house had gone quiet around them, that Abigail said very quietly, "He did it in front of everyone, Mama." "I know." Margaret's voice was steady. "Thomas Alcott sent word an hour ago. Jonathan rehearsed it." Abigail looked at her hands in her lap. He had the words ready. He'd chosen the moment. He wanted an audience. Margaret said nothing, but her jaw set in a particular way that Abigail had learned over 22 years to recognize as fury being deliberately contained. "He wanted to be seen as the one making the choice," Abigail continued. "If he'd ended it privately, people would have wondered. This way he controls the story. He walks away looking decisive. I walk away looking—" She stopped. "Looking like what?" her mother asked. "Like a woman who wasn't enough." The words sat in the air between them. Margaret reached across the table and covered Abigail's hand with her own, not squeezing, not comforting in the performative way, just present. Just there. "And Nathaniel Hawthorne," her mother said after a moment. "He was there." Abigail looked up. "You knew he was coming. Thomas mentioned it. He said Mr. Hawthorne had been in Richmond since this afternoon." Margaret paused. "He came to find me at 7:30, Thomas did. Said he'd spoken with Hawthorne. Said the man intended to be at the Whitmore estate by 9. He knew what Jonathan was planning. He suspected." Her mother's eyes were careful watching. "Did he behave well?" Abigail thought about the carriage, the steadiness, the directness. The way he had said, "Are you all right?" twice, as though the first answer hadn't satisfied him. The way he had not touched her not once beyond the offered hand. "He behaved exactly as he always did," she said. "Which is to say, he was entirely himself, and asked nothing in return for it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "You turned that man away 3 years ago." "I know. And tonight he came anyway." "I know, Mama." Margaret studied her daughter's face for a long moment, and then she said something Abigail did not expect. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be difficult, and you'll want to be rested for it." That was all. No lecture. No assessment of choices made or unmade. Just the plain, practical wisdom of a woman who understood that some reckonings needed to happen in daylight with clear eyes and a full night's rest behind them. Abigail slept badly and woke before dawn. She lay in the gray half-light of early morning and listened to the house breathe around her and tried to think about practical things, what the week ahead would require, which social engagements could be canceled gracefully, how to speak to her father when he arrived home from Fredericksburg in 2 days. Her father, Robert Carter, was a careful man, deliberate in all things, and he had never fully warmed to Jonathan Pierce. He had said nothing against the match, but he had said nothing strongly for it either, and Abigail had always understood that his silence on the matter was its own kind of opinion. She thought about all of that, and then, despite herself, she thought about Nathaniel Hawthorne, not about the carriage, not about what any of it meant, but about something much older and more specific. She thought about the afternoon 3 years ago when he had come to call at this house. She had been 23 that autumn, no 19. 19 years old, and the world had seemed very straightforward to her then, or at least she had wanted it to seem that way. Nathaniel Hawthorne had sat across from her in this very sitting room in the chair her mother was sitting in last night, and he had not made speeches. He had not brought flowers or poetry or any of the apparatus of courtship that she had been taught to expect. He had simply talked with her about the land, about books she'd read about, whether she thought Virginia's dependency on tobacco farming was going to hold through the next decade. She had been surprised by the conversation. She had found herself laughing twice, which she had not expected at all. And then at the end of the visit, when he was preparing to leave, he had turned to her and said plainly without theater, "Miss Carter, I think you're one of the most genuinely intelligent women I've met in this state, and I'd like to call again if you'd permit it." She had said she would think about it. And then Jonathan Pierce had come to a dinner party at the Alcott House the following week, and he had been luminous, magnetic. In that way, he had all attention and warmth and devastating charm, and he had looked at her across the table as though she were the only person in the room, and she had thought, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." And she had not thought carefully enough about the fact that Jonathan Pierce looked at every woman across every table as though she were the only person in the room. She had sent Nathaniel a polite note. She had said she did not think she would be able to receive callers at present. It was the coward's way of saying no, and she had known it when she wrote it, and she had written it anyway. He had not written back. He had not argued. He had simply, and this she thought now in the gray early morning, was the thing about him that she had never quite been able to set down. He had simply accepted her choice and disappeared. No wounded pride. No pressure. No manufactured coincidences or social maneuvers designed to keep himself in her orbit. He had taken her at her word and gone. 3 years later, he had come back. Not to reclaim anything. Not to say "I told you so." just to make sure she didn't have to stand alone in it. She got out of bed before the sun was fully up and went downstairs to make herself useful. The trouble started by noon. She heard it first from Clara, the Carter household's oldest and most reliable source of information. A sharp-eyed woman of 45 who had been with the family since before Abigail was born, and who treated the gathering of social intelligence as both professional duty and personal vocation. "There's talk in town," Clara said, setting down a tray of tea with a particular quality of carefulness that meant what she was about to say was significant. "About last night." Abigail did not look up from the household ledger she was reviewing. "There was always going to be talk. This kind is worse than the usual kind." Clara sat down across from her without being invited, which she did only when she thought something was important enough to warrant the breach of protocol. "People are saying Mr. Hawthorne came to the Whitmore estate last night because he and you had some prior arrangement. That the whole thing with Mr. Pierce was planned between the two of you. That you and Hawthorne—" She stopped. Now Abigail looked up. "That we what?" Clara met her eyes steadily. "That you'd been corresponding privately, for some time, and that Mr. Pierce found out, which is why he ended the engagement." The air went out of the room. Abigail set down her pen very carefully. She thought about Jonathan, about the cold precision with which he had constructed last night's performance, about the practiced regret on his face, about Thomas Alcott's word that he had been privately negotiating with the Hargrove family for 2 months. She thought about a man who had wanted to leave and had needed a reason that didn't make him look like a coward. And she thought about how very convenient it must have seemed in the planning to have Nathaniel Hawthorne's carriage available to become part of the story. "Jonathan told people this," she said. "It was not a question." "Jonathan told people that he had concerns," Clara said carefully. "He didn't name Mr. Hawthorne directly. He said he had reason to believe Miss Carter's affections had been divided." She paused. "He didn't need to name anyone. When Hawthorne's carriage showed up and you got in the story named itself." Abigail sat very still. This was the thing about Jonathan Pierce that she had never fully reckoned with. He was not simply vain, or selfish, or shallow, though he was all of those things. He was also genuinely strategic. He thought several moves ahead. He had ended the engagement publicly in front of witnesses, which meant any dispute of his version of events would look like exactly what it was: a woman trying to salvage her reputation. He had done it at an event attended by half of Virginia's social apparatus. And then, whether by calculation or extraordinary luck, Nathaniel Hawthorne's carriage had appeared at the exact moment required to give the story a villain who had nothing to do with Jonathan's gambling debts or his private negotiations with a wealthier family. She had been outmaneuvered before she even knew the game had started. "What are people saying about Mr. Hawthorne?" she asked. Clara's expression shifted not into pity, but into something more complicated. "Some people are saying he took advantage of a woman in distress. Some are saying he planned the whole thing from the start. Some are saying—" She paused again. "Some of the kinder ones are saying he behaved honorably, but the kinder ones are outnumbered this morning." Abigail stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the Carter lands. The broad fields, the tree line in the distance, the long drive that Nathaniel's carriage had rolled away down last night without any idea of what was coming. He had come to make sure she wasn't alone in it, and Jonathan had managed to make that into a weapon against both of them. "He needs to know," she said. "Miss Abigail, he's in Richmond. He needs to know what's being said before he hears it from someone who'll enjoy telling him." She turned. "Clara, I need paper and pen. Writing to him will only add fuel. I know." She was already moving toward the writing desk. "I know it will, but it's the right thing to do. He came last night without knowing what it would cost him, and I'm not going to let him find out about this from gossip when I could have warned him." She sat down. "And I'm not going to be the kind of woman who lets someone take damage on her behalf and says nothing about it because the saying something is inconvenient." Clara watched her for a moment, and then something in the older woman's face softened, not into approval exactly, but into recognition. "Your father would say the same thing," she said quietly. "Different words, same decision." Abigail wrote the letter in 20 minutes. She kept it short, factual, and without any of the emotion that was currently sitting like a stone in the center of her chest. She told him what was being said. She told him the shape of it, how Jonathan had constructed the narrative, how his presence at the Whitmore estate had been folded into a story that made both of them look dishonest. She told him she was sorry that his kindness had been made into this. And she said carefully, because she was a woman writing to a man in 1818 Virginia, and the letter might be read by other eyes, that she hoped he would take whatever steps he saw fit to protect his own good name, and that she did not hold him responsible for any of it. She sent it with the fastest rider in the Carter stable. His reply came back before sunset. She was in the garden when Clara brought it, not because she was in any condition to garden, but because the inside of the house had been feeling like a box all afternoon, and she needed air. She broke the seal and read it where she stood. "Miss Carter," it said. "Thank you for the warning. I had already heard some portion of it, though not the full shape. I am not concerned for my own reputation, which has weathered worse than this. I am concerned for yours, which has not. I intend to call on your family in the morning, if that is agreeable. I believe there are things worth saying openly that have been allowed to remain unsaid too long. But I will say nothing you have not given me leave to say. The choice, as it has always been, is entirely yours. Respectfully, N. Hawthorne." Abigail read it twice, then a third time. She folded it and held it in both hands and looked up at the summer sky, going gold at the edges with the late afternoon light. The phrase that stayed with her, the one that had always stayed with her, she realized across 3 years and a great many mistakes, was not the part about his reputation or the part about what he intended to say. It was the last part. The choice, as it has always been, is entirely yours. He had been saying that to her in one form or another since the first time they'd ever sat across from each other, and she had not understood at 19 that a man who actually meant those words was the rarest thing there was. He arrived the next morning at 10 o'clock, while Abigail was still at the breakfast table with her mother. Robert Carter had come home from Fredericksburg the previous evening, arriving late and road weary, and receiving the full account of the previous 2 days from his wife, while Abigail sat at the kitchen table and watched her father's face go through several distinct and controlled expressions. He had asked 3 questions. He had said 2 things. Then he had gone to his study and closed the door, and in the morning he had come down to breakfast, looking exactly as he always looked, steady, quiet, and in possession of whatever decision he had arrived at in the night. When Nathaniel Hawthorne's card was brought to the table, Robert Carter read it without expression, set it down beside his coffee, and said, "Send him in." Nathaniel walked into the Carter breakfast room without ceremony, and without the elaborate social scaffolding that most men of his wealth would have assembled for a visit of this particular weight. He greeted Margaret Carter first, then Abigail, then shook Robert's hand. He sat when invited to sit. He accepted coffee when it was offered. He did not, Abigail noticed, begin with pleasantries. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I imagine you know why I'm here." "I have several theories," her father said. "I'd prefer to hear it from you directly." "Then directly," Nathaniel said. "What's being said in town about your daughter is false, and it was manufactured by a man who needed a story that didn't feature his own failings. Miss Carter and I had no prior arrangement. She was as surprised to see my carriage as anyone at that party. I came because I had information about what Pierce was planning, and I thought someone who respected her ought to be present." He paused. "I also came because I have had a personal regard for your daughter for several years, and I did not think she should be left to manage a public humiliation alone." Robert Carter looked at him for a long moment. "You're being very plain about it. I find it's generally more useful than being vague." "Some men in your position would have sent lawyers," Robert said, "or let it settle itself." "Some men might." Nathaniel's voice was even. "I'm not comfortable with letting a woman take damage for something I had a hand in creating, even unintentionally. And I don't like lawyers much." Something shifted at the corner of Robert Carter's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. He looked at his daughter. Abigail met her father's eyes and said nothing. "What is it you're proposing to do?" Robert said, turning back to Nathaniel. "About the talk. I intend to be seen," Nathaniel said simply, Quietly and publicly and without drama. I will call here with your permission as a declared and respectable caller. That removes the secrecy that the rumors require. People can think what they like about the reason they will anyway, but they cannot call it hidden. He set his coffee cup down. What they cannot manufacture around a thing that happens openly is the same story they can manufacture around a thing that happens in shadows. And you want my permission to court my daughter, Robert said. I want your permission to call on her, Nathaniel said. What she does with that is entirely her decision. I won't ask for more than she's willing to give, and I won't pretend the situation is simpler than it is. She's just come through something difficult. I'm not here to replace one pressure with another. Robert Carter looked at his daughter again, and this time the look held a question. Abigail thought about the letter. She thought about the choice, as it has always been, is entirely yours. She thought about a man who had driven 40 minutes through a summer night to make sure she didn't have to stand alone, and who had in the last 3 years never once done anything to make her feel as though his absence was her fault to carry. You may call, she said. He looked at her just briefly, just a moment, and she saw in his face, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter and steadier. Relief, maybe. The relief of a man who has waited a long time for a door to stay open. Thank you, he said. He stayed for 40 minutes. He spoke with her father about farming, and about the state legislature, and about a land dispute that had been working its way through the courts in Kentucky. He spoke with her mother about the road conditions between Richmond and Fredericksburg. He spoke to Abigail about a book he had read, something on agricultural reform, that she had also read and disagreed with on 2 separate points, and they argued about it pleasantly and without any of the social delicacy that required one of them to concede before they were ready. When he stood to leave, he shook her father's hand again and bowed to her mother. He turned to Abigail and said simply, "Same time Thursday, if that's all right." "Thursday's fine," she said. And then he was gone. Her mother watched the window until the carriage had cleared the drive, and then she turned to her husband and said, "Well." Just that. Just well. But she said it in the voice she used when she had reached a conclusion she considered final. Her father picked up his coffee cup and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Different kind of man." "Yes," Abigail said. "He is." But the week that followed was not simple, and she had not expected it to be. The talk did not quiet when Nathaniel began calling openly. If anything, it organized itself the way that social cruelty always organizes itself when it is given time and material to work with. By Wednesday, Abigail had received 2 letters from women she had considered friends, both worded with the particular careful vagueness that allowed their writers to later claim they had meant nothing unkind. By Thursday morning, she had declined one invitation to a tea that she knew would be an exercise in being looked at, and Jonathan Pierce had not disappeared. That was the thing she had underestimated, the way that men like Jonathan, when they feel the narrative slipping, reach for more material. She heard it from Clara again on Thursday morning, an hour before Nathaniel was due to arrive. "He's been talking to the Hargroves," Clara said. "Not about their daughter, about you." Abigail set down her cup. "What specifically?" "That you encouraged Hawthorne's attentions while still engaged. That you were writing to him privately. That he has letters." Clara's voice was carefully neutral. "He doesn't, of course. But saying he does is nearly as effective as having them." "Of course it is," Abigail said. She was quiet for a moment. "He has to win the Hargrove family's approval before he can court their daughter, and the easiest way to do that is to make sure his previous engagement looks like my failing, not his." "That's exactly right," Clara said. "He's building a case, brick by brick." Abigail thought about the letters she had sent to Jonathan over 2 years, the careful, modest letters she had written, because that was what engaged women wrote, appropriate and measured, and showing none of the doubts she had kept to herself. She thought about how easy it was to take 2 years of appropriate correspondence and strip the context from it, and call it evidence of whatever the reader needed it to be. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "He won't." Nathaniel arrived at 10. He came in and sat down, and she told him, before he could ask about anything else, told him the full shape of it, The letters, the Hargroves, the brick-by-brick construction of a story designed to seal her reputation into something permanently damaged. She watched him listen. He did not interrupt. He did not make sounds of outrage or sympathy. He let her say all of it, and when she was finished, he sat with it for a moment, and she appreciated that too, the fact that he didn't reach for a response before he'd actually thought about it. "He needs this story to hold," Nathaniel said finally. "Yes. Which means the story has to be in place before the Hargroves make any decisions about him." "Yes. Which means we don't have a great deal of time." He looked at her. "Abigail, does your father have a solicitor he trusts?" She blinked slightly. "Thomas Alcott. Good. I need to speak with Alcott. There are financial matters regarding Pierce that are a matter of public record if you know where to look. Debts, promissory notes, at least 2 creditors in Richmond who have been very patient." He said it matter-of-factly the way he said most things. "He's been borrowing against the expectation of your dowry for months. That's not gossip, that's documentation. And documentation, in my experience, is considerably more useful than a story." She stared at him. "You already knew about the debts." "I knew about some of them," he said. "Alcott confirmed the shape of it before I came to the Whitmore estate. That's part of why I came." He paused. "Pierce isn't just a man who fell out of love with you, if he was ever in love with you at all. He's a man in financial trouble who made a calculated decision to exchange you for a larger settlement. That decision has legal implications, and legal implications have a way of changing the shape of social stories." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still in her lap. She thought about 2 years. 2 years of an engagement that had felt in moments like something real, and had turned out to be something she had been manufacturing in the space between what Jonathan said and what Jonathan meant. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry," she said. "I want to say that plainly. I'm not one of those women who is going to be dignified about this." The corner of his mouth moved. "Good. Dignified is overrated." "I'm furious," she said. "I'm furious that he did this publicly, and I'm furious that he had it planned, and I'm furious that I didn't see it, and I'm furious that his solution to his own cowardice is to burn down my reputation on his way out." "All of that sounds correct to me," Nathaniel said. "And I'm not going to let him," she said. The words landed in the room with a solidity she felt in her chest. "I want to be very clear about that. I am not going to sit here and be graceful and wait for this to blow over. He made a choice to do this in public, and he is going to discover that public choices have public consequences." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and then he said with a steadiness that she was beginning to understand was simply the register in which he operated, "Then let's go see Thomas Alcott." She stood up without hesitation. "Let me get my hat." They were out the door in 7 minutes. Clara watched them go, with an expression that Abigail, even in motion, caught the edge of, not surprise exactly, but a kind of measured approval, the look of a woman who has watched a girl become something else. The carriage ride to Thomas Alcott's office in Richmond took just over half an hour, and they spent most of it talking not about Jonathan, but about the practical machinery of what came next. Nathaniel laid out what he knew about the debt structure in plain terms, and she asked questions that he answered without condescension, and they built together between them the shape of an approach that did not require her to be a victim of anything. This, she thought, was new. This was a thing she had not known how to name before the experience of sitting across from a man and being treated as someone whose intelligence was simply part of the furniture, assumed and relied upon, rather than performed for. Jonathan had always slightly explained things, had always added the extra sentence that assumed she'd needed it, had always smiled a particular way when she offered an opinion, the way you smile at something charming and slightly unexpected. Nathaniel had not smiled at her once today in that manner. He had simply talked to her the way he talked directly and without protective scaffolding, and assumed she was keeping up because she was. When they reached Alcott's office, Nathaniel stepped back at the door and said, "You should lead this." She looked at him. "You're the one who was wronged," he said. "I'm here as support. Alcott knows that." She walked in first. Thomas Alcott was a compact, energetic man of 50, who had done legal work for both families long enough that he occupied the particular position of someone who knew everyone's business and had earned the right to be trusted with it. He stood when they entered, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and said, "Sit down. I've been expecting this conversation." "What do you know?" Abigail asked. He told them. And the picture that emerged over the next hour and 20 minutes was worse and better in its own way than she had anticipated. Jonathan Pierce owed money to 7 separate creditors in 3 counties. He had borrowed against the anticipated Carter dowry in at least 2 private arrangements that had been witnessed and documented. He had made promises to the Hargrove family about his financial standing that were provably false. And he had, in the process of managing all of this, committed at least one act that crossed the line from social dishonesty into something that had a legal name. "If he claims to have letters proving impropriety on Miss Carter's part," Alcott said, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands, "he will discover very quickly that claiming false evidence in a situation that has legal dimensions is a considerably more serious matter than he may have considered." "Can we stop him?" Abigail asked. "We can make it very clear what the cost of continuing will be," Alcott said. "Men like Jonathan Pierce are not brave. They are opportunistic. Remove the opportunity and the bravery evaporates." He looked at her steadily. "You have more ground to stand on than you think, Miss Carter. A great deal more." She absorbed that. 7 creditors. Borrowed against a dowry he no longer had claim to. False financial representations to a second family. The whole elaborate structure of it. The whole careful performance of a man who had been living several steps ahead of the truth for so long that the truth had simply become whatever story was most convenient. She thought about the ballroom, about the practiced regret on his face, about how she had stood there and thought, "Don't let them see it touch you." How she had pressed that ring into his palm with both hands and said, "I wish you well, Mr. Pierce," and walked out with her spine straight. She thought about how she had walked out of that ballroom thinking she was surviving the worst of it. She had not yet known that the worst was a man with documentation. But then again, neither had he. "Draw it up," she said to Alcott. "Whatever needs to be drawn up, I want it in his hands by the end of the week." Alcott nodded. He looked briefly at Nathaniel, who had been quiet through most of the meeting present, but not dominant there the way a solid wall is there something you can lean against without it pushing back. "You're not asking for anything to be hidden," Alcott said to her, making sure. "I'm not asking for anything to be hidden," she confirmed. "I'm asking for the truth to be in the same room as the story he's telling. That's all. The truth can do the rest." She said it calmly. She meant every word of it. And across the office, she saw something happen in Nathaniel Hawthorne's face, something that crossed it quickly and settled something that might, on a less composed man, have been mistaken for emotion. He said nothing. He simply looked at her and then looked away, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did that was not quite a smile. They left Alcott's office in the early afternoon. The walk back to the Carriage was short. The street was busy midweek midsummer Richmond going about its business, and twice Abigail noticed people recognize her. Noticed the flicker of recognition, followed by the particular adjustment of expression that social gossip produces in people who have already decided what they think. She walked with her chin up and her stride even, and she did not look at Nathaniel for confirmation of anything. She didn't need it. He held the carriage door for her. She stepped in. They rode back toward the Carterlands in companionable quiet, and somewhere along the road, with the summer heat pressing against the carriage windows and the fields going gold with late afternoon light, Abigail Carter felt the anger in her chest shift, not into something softer exactly, but into something more useful. Something with direction and purpose and the particular quality of energy that comes from knowing you have stopped being a passive object in someone else's story and started being the author of your own. "You're thinking," Nathaniel said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You look different when you're thinking about something that doesn't scare you anymore." She glanced at him. He was looking out the window, not at her. "You're very observant," she said. "I've been paying attention for a while," he said simply. She did not answer that. Not because she didn't want to, but because some things needed more space than a carriage ride home afforded. And she was relearning really from the beginning, that the difference between the right moment and the premature one was worth respecting. The carriage rolled on through the Virginia summer afternoon, and Abigail looked out her window and let herself, for the first time in several days, think not about what had been taken from her, but about what she was quietly and deliberately beginning to build. Thomas Alcott's letter reached Jonathan Pierce on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, all of Richmond knew something had shifted. Abigail heard it from Clara before supper. Not the specific contents, because Alcott had been discreet, but the effect. Jonathan had canceled 2 social engagements without explanation. He had been seen leaving his club early. He had sent a note to the Hargrove family requesting a postponement of a dinner that had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. Small movements, careful withdrawals. The particular behavior of a man who has just discovered that the ground he thought was solid has a great deal less beneath it than he assumed. "He's rattled," Clara said. "Good," Abigail said, and meant it without apology. But rattled men do not become peaceful men. That was the thing she should have anticipated and did not fully account for, that a man like Jonathan Pierce, when frightened, did not retreat into stillness. He retreated into motion, frantic lateral motion. He didn't stop pushing, he simply pushed in a different direction. She found out which direction on Saturday morning when her cousin arrived unannounced at the Carter house at 8:30. Dorothea Marsh was 26, married to a tobacco merchant, and possessed of the particular quality of loyalty that expresses itself primarily through the delivery of alarming information in a state of breathless agitation. She came through the front door still pulling off her riding gloves, and said before she had fully crossed the threshold, "Abigail, I need to speak with you immediately." They went to the sitting room. Dorothea sat on the edge of the chair across from her cousin and leaned forward and said, "Jonathan Pierce was at the Fairfax Assembly last night." "That's not a surprise," Abigail said carefully. "He was there with Edmund Hargrove." Dorothea's voice dropped though there was no one close enough to hear. "And he spent most of the evening telling anyone who would listen, that you have a prior history with Nathaniel Hawthorne that goes back much further than this past week. That the 2 of you were involved before your engagement to Jonathan ever began. That Jonathan only recently discovered correspondence that proved it." Abigail did not move for a moment. "He's claiming letters," she said. "He's describing them," Dorothea said. "Specifically, he mentioned dates. He mentioned—" She stopped. "Abigail, he's not being vague about it. He's being very specific. Specific enough that people are starting to believe there's something real behind it." "There's nothing real behind it," Abigail said. "I know that." Dorothea's eyes were direct. "But he's describing things specifically enough that when people ask themselves whether Jonathan Pierce would invent details, the answer they arrive at is probably not. Which means the specificity is the strategy," Abigail said. She said it quietly and evenly, and with the controlled anger of someone who has moved past the stage of surprise and arrived at the stage of precise, clear-eyed fury. She understood it now with complete clarity. Jonathan had realized that Alcott's letter had changed the financial terrain, so he had moved the battle entirely onto social ground, where documentation was irrelevant, and where the only currency was the credibility of the story being told most convincingly. He had invented details, specific dates and specific descriptions, and specific enough particulars that the details themselves would become the evidence. People would think, why would he know that much if it weren't true? It was precisely what a man with nothing real to offer would manufacture. "How many people heard him last night?" Abigail asked. "Enough," Dorothea said. "It will be everywhere by Monday." Abigail stood up. She walked to the window. She pressed one hand flat against the frame and stood there for 3 breaths, not to compose herself because her composure was entirely intact, but because she needed the 3 breaths to move from the recognition of the problem to the recognition of what had to happen next. "Does Nathaniel know?" she asked. "I don't know what Nathaniel knows," Dorothea said. "I came here first. He needs to know before he hears it from someone who'll enjoy telling him." Abigail turned. "Dorothea, I need you to stay here with my mother for the next hour. Tell her what you told me. She'll want the full account and she'll need to be prepared." Dorothea blinked. "Where are you going?" "To find Nathaniel Hawthorne," Abigail said. And she was already moving. She rode to the boarding house on Carey Street where Nathaniel kept his Richmond rooms during his Virginia business, a fact she had learned from Alcott, and had filed away without fully examining the reason she'd filed it. She arrived before 9 in the morning without sending word ahead and asked the proprietor if Mr. Hawthorne was in. He was. He came downstairs 3 minutes later, coat half-buttoned, expression alert in the way of a man accustomed to early mornings and capable of reading a person's face for information before a word has been exchanged. He read her face. His own shifted immediately into something watchful and focused. "What happened?" she told him. Standing in the front parlor of the boarding house with the proprietor tactfully absent and the summer morning pressing against the windows, she told him every particular that Dorothea had given her, including the invented dates and the manufactured specificity and the particular audience Jonathan had chosen to tell it to. Nathaniel listened. He stood very still, the way he always stood when he was processing something, and he let her finish, and then he said, "He fabricated specific details." "Yes." "About correspondence between us." "Yes." A beat of silence. Then, "When specifically?" "He cited a date in March of 1815, she said. "A letter he claims I wrote to you while you were in Lexington." Nathaniel looked at her. "I was not in Lexington in March of 1815. I was in Philadelphia for the entirety of that spring. My travel records from that period are documented. There are business records, bank transactions, correspondence with partners." He said it flatly, without triumph. Just fact. "He chose a date when he had no idea where I was, which means he invented it without checking." Abigail stared at him. Something moved through her chest, not relief exactly, but the very specific sensation of watching a man's lie begin to fall apart in the light. "We can prove it," she said. "We can prove it," he confirmed. "Alcott will know what's needed. Bank records from that spring are a matter of financial documentation." He looked at her steadily. "He made a mistake. Men who rely on bluster usually do. They reach for the detail that sounds convincing without checking whether it can be disproven." He paused. "He thought we wouldn't fight back this way. He thought you'd be too concerned with appearances to go looking through financial records." "He thought wrong," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He did." They were at Alcott's office within the hour. The solicitor listened to the development with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years watching people underestimate the consequences of their choices and has arrived at a permanent state of unsurprised disappointment. "Lexington in March of 1815, Alcott repeated. "Philadelphia," Nathaniel said. "The entire spring. I have records of bank drafts made from the Philadelphia Commercial Bank in March and April of that year, correspondence with 2 separate business partners, a hotel ledger if it still exists." "It'll exist," Alcott said. He was already writing. "Hotels of that period kept meticulous records. I'll have someone in Philadelphia by the end of the week." He looked up at Abigail. "This shifts things considerably, Miss Carter. False statements made publicly about a person's character, which can be demonstrably disproven with documentation that's not merely social indiscretion. That crosses into territory with legal consequences. Serious ones." "I want him stopped," Abigail said. "Not punished, not destroyed, stopped. I want the lies to stop." "If we do this correctly," Alcott said, "stopping him will be enough. A man whose fabrications are publicly disproven loses the credibility to continue making them." He set down his pen. "But I want to warn you, this will get worse before it gets better. When cornered men realize they've made a provable error, they don't go quiet. They escalate." "Let him escalate," Abigail said. "Escalation leaves evidence." Alcott looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Then he said, "Where have you been hiding this woman?" with the tone of a man who was largely speaking to himself. Nathaniel said nothing, but Abigail in her peripheral vision saw his expression do the thing it did. The small controlled movement at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile and was better than one. Alcott was right. It got worse. By Monday, Jonathan had moved beyond private conversations at assemblies into something more deliberate. He had written a letter not to Abigail, not to Nathaniel, but to Robert Carter. Abigail's father read it at the breakfast table and set it down and was quiet for a full minute before he spoke. "He's requesting a private meeting," Robert said. "He says he has information about Mr. Hawthorne's character that he feels a father has the right to know." Abigail looked at her father across the table. Margaret Carter set down her coffee cup with a precision that indicated everything she chose not to say. "What kind of information?" Abigail asked. "He doesn't specify," Robert said. "He only says it pertains to Mr. Hawthorne's previous dealings with women in Kentucky." He folded the letter. "He's being deliberately vague. The vagueness is designed to make me afraid to know." "Are you?" Abigail asked. Her father looked at her. "I've known Thomas Alcott for 22 years. Thomas Alcott has known Nathaniel Hawthorne for longer than that. Alcott is the single most careful judge of character I have ever encountered, and he would sooner burn his own office down than vouch for a man he didn't believe in." Robert set the letter to one side. "So, no, I'm not afraid of what Jonathan Pierce claims to know about Nathaniel Hawthorne's character." "But you'll respond to the letter," Abigail said. "I'll respond to the letter," her father confirmed. "Because ignoring it gives him the ability to say he tried to warn me. I'll invite him here. I'll hear what he has to say, and then I'll make a decision based on what I actually know, not what he wants me to be afraid of." He said it the way he said all things, with a quiet that was not passivity, but was something closer to bedrock. Abigail had grown up with that quality in her father, and had sometimes mistaken it for slowness. She understood now that it was the opposite of slowness. It was the particular speed of a man who only moves when he is certain, and is therefore almost never wrong. Jonathan arrived at the Carter house on Tuesday afternoon. Abigail was not in the room when he came. Her father had been specific about that not because he wanted to shield her from it, but because he understood that her presence would make Jonathan perform rather than speak, and performance was the last thing any of them needed more of. She waited in the upstairs sitting room and heard voices below without being able to distinguish words, and she occupied the 40 minutes with a letter to Dorothea that she had been meaning to write, and with the conscious, deliberate discipline of not going to the top of the stairs to listen. Clara came upstairs at the end of 40 minutes and knocked on the doorframe. "Your father wants you," she said. She went down. Jonathan was still in the room. She had not expected that, had assumed her father would have concluded the meeting before sending for her. But Jonathan was there, seated across from Robert Carter, and when Abigail came in, he rose from his chair in a show of courtesy that she recognized as the most elaborate thing he had done all afternoon. She looked at him. He looked different than he had at the Whitmore estate. Not in any way she could point to, precisely still the same handsome, well-constructed face, still the same controlled posture. But something behind his eyes was working harder than usual. He was calculating in real time, and it showed. "Abigail," he said. "Mr. Pierce," she said. Her father said, "Jonathan has expressed a desire to speak with you directly. I told him that was your decision." She looked at Jonathan. "Say what you've come to say." He glanced at her father, a clear request for privacy. Robert Carter did not move. Jonathan adjusted. "I think," he said carefully, "that we've both allowed this situation to become more adversarial than it needs to be. I didn't come here as an enemy. I came because I believe there are things between us that deserve a real conversation. Not lawyers. Not letters." He paused. "I made a mistake in how I handled the Whitmore evening. I can admit that. The manner was wrong. The public nature of it, I understand how it looked." "How it looked," Abigail repeated. "How it felt." He corrected himself with a slight adjustment that was clearly practiced. "I understand how it felt, and I want you to know that nothing I've done since then has come from any desire to hurt you. I'm trying to manage a situation that got larger than I intended." "The letters you invented," she said. A beat of silence. A very particular beat, the kind that happens when a man realizes he has significantly underestimated the person he is talking to. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "The correspondence you described to Edmund Hargrove and half the Fairfax Assembly," she said. "The letter dated March of 1815, which you claimed I sent to Nathaniel Hawthorne while he was in Lexington." She watched him. "He was in Philadelphia that spring. We have bank records, hotel records, and correspondence with 2 documented business partners confirming his location for the entirety of March and April of that year. Your letter doesn't exist because the meeting you claim preceded it couldn't have happened." The color in Jonathan's face changed. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for that, but the change was there, and it was visible, and it was the most honest thing she had seen on his face in 2 years. He started. "If you're about to say that's a misunderstanding," Abigail said, "I'd suggest you think carefully about whether that word will be adequate when this is presented to the people you told your story to, including Edmund Hargrove, whose family's decision-making about you depends rather significantly on your being a man who tells the truth." Jonathan was quiet. Robert Carter had not moved. He sat in his chair with his hands folded and his expression completely still, and he let his daughter stand there and do what she was doing, and Abigail understood in that moment, with a clarity that moved through her like cold water, that this was exactly what her father had sent for her to do. He had not asked Jonathan to stay so she could be protected from him. He had asked Jonathan to stay so she could face him. "Jonathan," she said, and the use of his given name was deliberate, not intimate, but leveling, stripping away the Mr. Pierce formality that gave him social architecture to hide inside. "You came here in debt. You pursued an engagement with me because my family's land represented a way out of the financial situation you'd made for yourself. When you found a better option, you left. That's the complete story. Everything else, the public announcement, the invented correspondence, the warning letters to my father about Nathaniel Hawthorne's character, all of that is scaffolding. You're building around the truth because the truth doesn't flatter you." He did not respond immediately. She had never seen him without a response ready. It was briefly, involuntarily, something like satisfying. "I am going to give you one clear account of what happens next," she said. "Mr. Alcott has documentation of 7 separate debts in 3 counties. He has records of promissory arrangements made against a dowry you no longer have claim to. He has detailed correspondence that I don't need to enumerate here because you already know what's in it." She paused. "If the talk stops, if the letters and the assemblies and the campaigns to Mr. Hargrove stop, then Alcott's information remains where it is, in his office. Not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper, not in a letter to your creditors confirming that the asset you've been borrowing against is gone." She looked at him steadily. "If it doesn't stop, then the documentation goes where it needs to go. And documentation, in my experience, is considerably more useful than a story." She had borrowed the last line from Nathaniel. She was aware of that. Jonathan Pierce looked at her across the Carter sitting room in the summer afternoon heat, and she watched something happen in him. Something deflate or recalculate, or simply give up the particular pretense that he had been maintaining probably for years, that he was the smartest person in any room he entered. He picked up his hat. He said without meeting her eyes, "Good day, Miss Carter." He said without any inflection at all, "Good day, Mr. Carter." And then he walked out. Abigail heard the front door close. She heard his horse on the drive. She heard him go. Her father was quiet for a moment after. Then he said with the tone of a man delivering a considered assessment, "Well done." She sat down. Her legs were not entirely steady, and she didn't mind that she had stayed upright for the part that required it, and now she could afford a moment of something more human. "Did he say anything useful before I came down?" she asked. "Nothing that wasn't about himself," her father said. "He started with concern for you, moved quickly to the Hawthorne character issue, spent about 15 minutes on information he implied, but never stated which told me the information doesn't exist." Robert picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. "He's frightened. Frightened men try to negotiate, and when negotiation fails, they try to threaten, and when threats fail, they go home. He's at the third stage. You think he'll let it go, she said. I think he'll let it go, her father said. Men like Jonathan Pierce are fundamentally interested in their own survival. This has stopped being survivable for him. He looked at his daughter. The question now is what you want, not what needs to happen with Pierce that's managed. What you want. She looked at her father. He held her gaze with that same bedrock patience that had always meant he would wait as long as she needed. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's all right, he said. You've got time to find out. She thought about that answer for the rest of the day, carried it with her through the afternoon and into the evening, turning it over and examining it from different angles, the way she did with books. She wasn't sure she'd understood correctly the first time through. She had time. She was 22 years old, and she had the rest of her life in front of her, and the particular freedom strange and unfamiliar of a woman who had stopped carrying someone else's story about who she was. Nathaniel came on Thursday, as he had said he would. He came in and sat down, and she told him about Jonathan's visit without editorializing, giving him the account straight. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention, and no performance of attention, and when she was finished, he said, he left without making any specific threats. He left without saying much of anything, she said. I think he was surprised. He underestimated you, Nathaniel said. It was a statement, not a compliment. Just an observation of fact. A great many people have, she said. I know. A pause. I didn't. She looked at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away, and they sat with it for a moment, the full weight of what that sentence contained, which was considerable. You said that, she noted carefully, 3 years ago, when I turned you away. I said something like it, he agreed. I said you were worth more than you were currently asking for. And then you left. You asked me to. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that. The way you left. No argument, no second attempt. You just went. Would you have wanted me to argue? He asked. She considered it honestly. No, she said. At the time, no. At the time, I would have resented it. I would have thought you presumptuous. That's why I didn't. He turned his coffee cup slightly on the table, a small and absent motion. I thought arguing would have meant I hadn't actually heard what you were saying. And if I hadn't heard you, I wouldn't have deserved to come back. Abigail sat very still. But you did come back, she said. You didn't ask me not to come back, he said. You asked me not to call. Those are different things. He looked at her. And when the circumstances changed when I heard what Pierce was planning, I thought 3 years of not calling had been long enough. She looked at him for a long time. The summer afternoon was going golden through the windows, and the house was quiet around them, and she was aware of having arrived at a moment that she had been circling for several days without letting herself approach it directly. Nathaniel, she said. He went still, the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to assume. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it the way you answer everything, without decoration. All right, he said. Why did you come back? She held his gaze. Not the Alcott version. Not the version where you heard what Jonathan was planning and came to make sure I wasn't alone. The real version. Why did you come back? He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man searching for the right words. The silence of a man deciding how honest to be, arriving at the conclusion that full honesty was the only option that would serve. Because I never stopped thinking you were worth waiting for, he said. And I'm 36 years old, and I have a great deal of land, and a great many responsibilities, and very little patience left for situations that aren't worth the trouble. You are worth the trouble. He said it without drama, without embellishment. That's the complete answer. She breathed, one breath slow and deliberate. I'm not in love with you, she said. I want to be honest about that. I don't know you well enough to be in love with you. And I spent 2 years telling myself I was in love with a man I didn't actually know, so I'm not inclined to make that mistake again. I know, he said. But I think... She stopped, started again. I think I was wrong to turn you away 3 years ago. Not because of how things went with Jonathan, that's not the reason. The reason is that I dismissed you because you didn't perform, and I've come to understand that performance is the opposite of what I should have been looking for. She held his gaze. I'd like to give this a real chance. Whatever this is. At the correct pace, and without either of us pretending to more than we actually have yet. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then, that's the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in a long time. I'm a sensible person, she said. I've always thought so. He agreed. She felt something ease in her chest. Not the resolution of everything, not the end of the tangle, but the specific release of a woman who has said a true thing out loud and discovered the world has not ended because of it. You should know, he said after a moment, that I intend to call every Thursday, and possibly Tuesdays. Possibly Tuesdays, she repeated. The possibly is purely diplomatic, he said. I intend Tuesdays. She felt laughter move through her, real laughter, not the social variety, not the performed kind, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. Thursday and Tuesday, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. There was a particular quality to the afternoon after that, a settling, a recalibration. The feeling of two people who have been carefully navigating difficult terrain, arriving at a small flat space, and choosing to rest in it for a moment before moving forward. They talked about other things, about the Carter land management, about a law being proposed in the state legislature, about the book they had been arguing about the week before. He had reread 2 chapters she had challenged him on. She had been right on one point. He had been right on the other. They agreed on this with the particular satisfaction of 2 people who are not competing. When he stood to leave, he said, Alcott has sent to Philadelphia. We should have the documentation within the week. Do you think Jonathan will push further before then? I think he's running the numbers, Nathaniel said, and finding they don't add up in his favor. But I'll know more by Thursday. He picked up his hat. You did something very courageous this week, Abigail. I want to say that plainly, because I find that plain statements tend to land more honestly than decorative ones. She looked at him. Courageous would be the wrong word, she said. Necessary is closer. He forced me into a position where retreating was more dangerous than standing. I stood. That's not courage. That's just arithmetic. Nathaniel smiled, a real one this time, not the controlled suggestion of one, but the actual thing which she realized she had not seen before and which changed the whole architecture of his face. All right, he said. Necessary arithmetic. He moved toward the door. Thursday. Thursday, she said. She heard him go, heard the carriage on the drive, heard the quiet settle back into the house. And then from the kitchen, she heard Clara's voice, not directed at her. Just Clara talking to the cook in the entirely ordinary way of the household managing its daily business, and the absolute ordinariness of it hit her somewhere unexpected. The world was continuing. The house was continuing. She was still here, still standing still, the same person she had been before a man in a ballroom handed back her future, and she discovered in the aftermath that it was lighter without his weight in it. She thought about Thursday. She thought about Tuesday. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years waiting not because she had asked him to, but because he had decided she was worth the patience, and who had returned not to claim anything, but to make sure she didn't have to stand alone. She thought about how much she did not yet know about Nathaniel Hawthorne. And for the first time in a very long time, the not knowing felt less like uncertainty and more like the beginning of something she actually wanted to find out. Clara appeared in the doorway. Supper in an hour, she said. Thank you, Clara, Abigail said. He stayed longer than last time, Clara observed with the studied neutrality of a woman who has strong opinions and the good sense to package them as observations. He did, Abigail agreed. Clara nodded once, a small decisive nod, and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Abigail sat in the quiet of the sitting room and looked at her hands in her lap and thought with a kind of steady, forward-facing clarity that felt entirely new that she had no idea what was coming next. That she had been wrong before about things she had been certain of. That being wrong before did not make her incapable of being right. It made her more careful, more deliberate, more genuinely attentive to the difference between what a man says and who a man is. She was 22 years old. She had given back a ring. She had faced down the man who had tried to use her silence as a weapon. She had sat in a solicitor's office and built a case out of documented facts and made a decision that terrified her slightly and felt correct entirely. She did not know what Nathaniel Hawthorne was, not yet. She only knew what he had done and what he had refrained from doing, and those two things together added up to more than most men offered in a lifetime of performance. That would have to be enough for now. And for now, she thought it genuinely was. The Philadelphia documentation arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after Alcott had sent his man north. Abigail was at the writing desk working through household accounts when Clara brought the letter in, not just Alcott's summary, but the actual copies witnessed and notarized of bank drafts made from the Philadelphia Commercial Bank on the 14th, 19th, and 23rd of March, 1815, each bearing Nathaniel Hawthorne's signature. There was a hotel ledger entry. There were 2 letters from business partners, both dated during the same period, both addressed to Nathaniel at his Philadelphia accommodations. Every piece of it was clean, documented, and irrefutable. Jonathan Pierce had described a letter written in March of 1815 from a woman in Virginia to a man he claimed was in Lexington, Kentucky. The man had been 400 miles away in Pennsylvania. The letter had never existed, and now there was paper that proved it. Abigail read through every page twice. Then she set the documents down on the desk, pressed both hands flat against the surface, and took one slow breath. This was the moment she had been building toward for 2 weeks, the moment when the fabrication hit the documentation and the fabrication lost. She had known it was coming. She had worked toward it deliberately. But knowing a thing is coming and feeling it arrive are entirely different experiences, and what she felt sitting at that desk with the Philadelphia records in front of her was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been fighting a battle they never asked for and has finally reached the point where the fighting can stop. She sent a note to Alcott immediately. She sent a second note to Nathaniel. He arrived before noon. He came in without ceremony, the way he always came in. Now easy, unhurried, with the quality of presence that Abigail had come to recognize as his particular signature. He sat down, and she put the documents in front of him, and he read them with the same focused stillness he brought to everything. When he finished, he set the papers down and said, "How do you want to handle this?" She had been thinking about that since the letter arrived. She had turned the question over from every angle, considering what Jonathan deserved, what she needed, what the outcome actually had to accomplish to be worth the effort of accomplishing it. "Alcott takes it to Edmund Hargrove directly," she said. "Not as a threat, as information. The Hargroves are being courted by a man who has made false statements about a documented timeline. They have a right to know that before they make any decisions." She paused. "And Alcott notifies the 2 creditors in Richmond who have been waiting on Jonathan's debts. Not to destroy him, just to make clear that the asset they assumed was behind the debt no longer exists." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's precise." "I'm not trying to ruin him," she said. "I'm trying to stop him. Those are different things. If I wanted to ruin him, I'd take all of this to the Richmond Inquirer and let them do the work." She looked at the documents. "I want him to understand that what he built his lies on doesn't exist, and I want the people he's been misleading to have accurate information. After that, what happens to Jonathan Pierce is Jonathan Pierce's business." "The Hargroves will withdraw," Nathaniel said. "Probably. His creditors will call in the notes." "Probably," she said again. "But that's the consequence of what he did, not of what I'm doing. I'm just moving accurate information into the rooms where it belongs." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. 3 weeks ago, you were standing on the Whitmore steps trying to decide whether to get in a carriage." 3 weeks ago, I had fewer documents," she said. He laughed, a real one, brief and genuine, and she felt it in her own chest, the particular warmth of having made someone she respected laugh when she hadn't been performing for it. Alcott moved quickly. By Thursday evening, Edmund Hargrove had received a visit. By Friday morning, the shape of Jonathan Pierce's world had changed substantially, and he knew it because he appeared at the Carter house for the second time in 2 weeks, and this time he did not send a card ahead. Clara came to find Abigail in the upstairs sitting room. "He's at the door," she said, and her voice had the careful flatness of a woman preparing for the possibility of an unpleasant scene. "Is my father home?" Abigail asked. "Out on the east field." "Send for him," Abigail said, "and show Mr. Pierce to the front parlor." She took her time going downstairs. Not to make a point, or not entirely, but because she had learned something in the past 3 weeks about the value of arriving in a room from a position of steadiness rather than reaction. She went downstairs at her own pace and walked into the front parlor and found Jonathan standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when she came in, and she saw immediately that the performance was gone. The careful, practiced face, the controlled expression that had served him so reliably across so many rooms had been replaced by something rawer and less managed. He looked like a man who had spent a sleepless night arriving at the unpleasant conclusion that he had miscalculated on a fundamental level. "You went to the Hargroves," he said. "Thomas Alcott went to the Hargroves," she said, "with documentation. You know what this does to me." His voice was not threatening. It was the voice of a man making an argument he already knows has lost. "The Hargroves won't Abigail. They won't Jonathan." She kept her voice even. "You invented letters. You described specific dates and specific circumstances and presented them to people whose social opinions carry real consequences, and those specific details were provably false. What did you think would happen when the documentation surfaced?" "I thought you wouldn't look for documentation," he said. And the honesty of it, the naked, undefended admission that he had counted on her not fighting back, hit the room with a weight he clearly hadn't intended. He heard himself say it. She watched him hear it. She watched him understand what he had revealed about the entire calculation, that it had been built on the assumption of her passivity, her concern for appearances, her willingness to absorb damage rather than return it. He had designed an attack against a woman he had predicted would not defend herself. "I see," she said quietly. "I didn't mean—" He stopped, restarted. "The financial situation is, Abigail, I am in a genuinely difficult position. I made decisions that I thought were prudent at the time, and they compounded in ways I didn't foresee. And when the Whitmore situation happened, I was already—" He stopped again, ran one hand over his face. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I know I've forfeited that. I'm asking you to understand that what I did came from desperation, not from—" "From what?" she said. "Not from cruelty, not from contempt." She looked at him steadily. "Jonathan, you stood in front of 100 people and humiliated me. And then you spent 2 weeks building a story designed to damage my reputation and my future because the story protected yours. Whether that came from desperation or calculation, or both, doesn't change what it was." He had no answer for that. She had not expected one. Her father arrived 4 minutes later, coming in from the field still in his working coat. He looked at Jonathan, assessed the situation, with the efficiency of a man who had already largely assessed it, and said, "What do you need, Mr. Pierce?" Jonathan looked between them. Father and daughter, the same quality of stillness in both of them, the same quality of having already arrived at whatever decision was necessary. Something in him seemed to simply give up. Not dramatically. Just the quiet giving up of a man who has run out of moves. "I'd like to ask," he said slowly, "that Alcott's office not take further action against the creditors. I'll make arrangements with them directly. I'll handle the Hargrove situation myself." He paused. "And I'll make clear to anyone I've spoken to about this that I was mistaken in what I implied about Miss Carter's character." Robert Carter looked at his daughter. "Publicly mistaken," Abigail said. "In the same rooms where the implications were made." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said. "Publicly." "Then Alcott will hold where he is," Abigail said. "On the condition that it stays held. If the talk starts again from any direction, the documentation goes to every person it needs to go to, without warning and without negotiation. She held his gaze. I want to be clear that this is not a negotiation, Jonathan. This is the terms. I understand, he said. Good, she said. I think we're finished. He left. The door closed behind him. Robert Carter stood in the entrance of the front parlor and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has watched something he is proud of and is choosing not to make a speech about it. You didn't need me down here, he said. I didn't, she agreed. But I wanted a witness. He nodded. Smart. He turned to go. Alcott's going to want to know about this by end of day. I'll write to him this afternoon, she said. Her father went back to the east field. Abigail stood alone in the front parlor and felt the specific unfamiliar quality of a fight that has finished on her terms. She had expected to feel more. She had expected triumph or relief, or some emotional crescendo commensurate with the scale of the previous 3 weeks. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, a steady sense of having stood where she needed to stand and not moved. She wrote to Alcott. She wrote to Dorothea, who deserved a full account, and had earned it by being the first person to warn her. And then she wrote a short note to Nathaniel telling him what had happened, because by this point he was the person she most wanted to tell. His response came back quickly. 4 lines. The terms were fair. The witness was smart. Thursday as usual. And for what it is worth, I have never once doubted you were capable of exactly this. She read it twice, folded it, held it for a moment, set it down. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of a day that knows it is different from the days before it without making a production of being different. Nathaniel came at the regular time, sat in the regular chair, accepted the regular coffee. But something had shifted in the space between them. Some membrane of formality or careful navigation that had been present since the beginning had thinned, and they both felt it, and neither of them mentioned it directly, because neither of them was the kind of person who needed to annotate every change out loud. They talked for 2 hours. About the land management questions her father had been wrestling with. About a letter Nathaniel had received from his attorney in Lexington concerning a boundary dispute with a neighboring property. About whether the agricultural reform book they had been arguing over for 3 weeks was actually wrong in its central thesis, or merely imprecise in its methodology. A distinction Abigail maintained was significant, and Nathaniel was coming around to accepting. At some point during the second hour, she noticed that she had forgotten to sit in the formal way she had been sitting for the first 3 visits, the careful posture, the managed distance. She was simply sitting, the way a person sits when they are comfortable. She noticed it and decided not to correct it. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat and then set it back down and said, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, I'll accept it without argument and without making it uncomfortable afterward. She looked at him. All right, I'd like to take you riding Saturday morning, he said. Not a social call, not a structured visit, just riding. The Carter lands if your father agrees. I know this country well enough and I'd like to see it with you. He paused. The pace of Thursday visits is good. I'm not trying to push past it. I'd like more of it. More of you in a context that isn't this room. Abigail looked at him for a moment. She thought about the past 3 weeks, about the carriage ride home from the Whitmore estate, about the documents laid out on Alcott's desk, about the way he had sat in the background during the Jonathan meeting and let her lead without once suggesting he should be in front of her. She thought about what he had said in this room the first time they had spoken directly about the history between them. I've been paying attention for a while. Saturday, she said. Yes. Something in his face did the thing it did. The small certain movement that she had come to understand was the most honest expression he had. Thank you, he said. The Saturday ride was the thing that changed it. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories that require a single catalytic moment to announce themselves. It changed the way that most real things change gradually, and then suddenly, and mostly, in the quiet spaces between what was said. They rode for 3 hours. The Carter lands were broad and varied cultivated fields, giving way to stretches of timber, a creek that ran along the eastern boundary, a ridge that looked out over the whole property from the north. Nathaniel knew how to ride the way he knew how to do most things without exhibition, with the easy competence of a man who has been doing something long enough that it has become simply part of how he moves through the world. He asked questions about the land. Practical, specific questions about yield and drainage, and the timber management her father had been applying, and she answered them with the same practicality because she had been her father's closest student since she was old enough to walk the fields, and she knew Carterland as well as she knew her own name. "Your father taught you all of this," Nathaniel said somewhere along the ridge. "My father taught me that a woman who understands her own property is a woman who can't be cheated out of it," she said. He had a very practical way of seeing things. "I like him," Nathaniel said simply. "He likes you," she said. He hasn't said so directly, but he uses the tone he uses for people he respects. You can tell by the length of the sentences. Short sentences mean he's being polite. Long sentences mean he's actually interested. Nathaniel looked at her. "How long were the sentences about me?" "Quite long," she said. He smiled. The real one, the one that changed the architecture of his face. She had been collecting those smiles without quite realizing she was doing it. They stopped near the creek to water the horses, and in the quiet that followed the horses drinking the summer morning, moving around them with the ordinary sounds of birds and water, and the distant work sounds of the farm. Abigail said something she had not planned to say. "I think I've been afraid of you," she said. "Not of you specifically, of what you represent, because what you represent is something I'd have to be honest to receive." He was quiet. She continued. "Jonathan was easy," she said. "Not easy to love. I'm not sure I ever loved him, and that's something I've had to sit with, but easy to accept because he came with all the expected trappings. The charm, the performance, the beautiful words in the right order. I knew how to receive that. It required nothing from me but the social grace to seem appropriately flattered." She looked at the water. "You're different. There's no performance to hide behind. You just say things directly, and then wait to see what I do with them, and that means whatever I do with them is actually mine. I can't blame it on being swept away or confused or charmed. Which means I have to be honest." She paused. That's frightening for a person who spent 2 years being less than fully honest with herself. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. The horses moved slightly. The creek ran. "I know," he said finally. "I watched you work that out, over the last 3 weeks." She looked at him. "You watched me. I've been watching you for 3 years," he said. Not as a confession, as a plain fact. First from a distance, then from this particular close range. You're one of the most intelligent people I know, Abigail. But intelligence doesn't protect you from choosing what's familiar over what's true. I waited because I thought if I give her time, she'll work her way to it. She'll arrive at honest on her own terms. He looked at her directly. "I didn't want to be something you chose because I was there. I wanted to be something you chose because you'd looked at the whole picture." She held his gaze. "And now I think you've looked at the whole picture," he said. She breathed once slowly. "I'm not going to pretend I have certainty I don't have. I told you that before, and I meant it." "I know you did." "But I think I'd like to find out," she said. "Honestly, at the right pace, without either of us pretending we're further along than we are." "That's exactly what I'd like," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not the dramatic pivot of a romance that announces itself with speeches and gestures. It was 2 people on horseback beside a creek agreeing to be honest with each other about something they hadn't yet fully named. And that Abigail thought that plainness, that willingness to say what was true rather than what was beautiful, was exactly the thing she had been missing for so long. She had forgotten it was possible. The weeks that followed moved differently. Thursday and Tuesday visits continued, but they expanded in quality, longer conversations, more argument, more of the easy silence that develops between people who have stopped needing to fill every space with social performance. Nathaniel began accompanying her father on the occasional review of the Carter property boundary questions, and the two men developed between them the particular shorthand of people who communicate primarily through practical observation and respect each other for it. Margaret Carter watched all of this with the expression she wore when she was thinking something she had decided not to say yet. She said it in late August when she and Abigail were alone in the kitchen and the evening was cooling toward autumn. "He's a man who shows you who he is immediately," Margaret said. "From the very first moment. There's nothing hidden. He doesn't need you to look harder than the surface, because the surface is all there is." She paused. "That's rarer than people think." "I know," Abigail said. "Your father and I knew each other for 3 weeks before I was sure," her mother said. "Not 3 weeks of courtship. 3 weeks of watching him when he didn't think anyone was paying attention." She looked at her daughter. "What have you seen when Mr. Hawthorne doesn't think you're watching?" Abigail thought about it. She thought about the way he had handled the Alcott meeting sitting back, deferring, making space for her to lead. She thought about the way he spoke to Clara when Clara brought coffee without condescension, without the particular performance of graciousness that rich men put on for servants when other people are watching. She thought about the Saturday ride and the way he had asked questions about the Carter land not to seem interested, but because he actually was, and about the difference between those two things, which was enormous. "He's the same," she said. "When no one's watching, he's exactly the same." Her mother nodded. Once, the decisive nod. "Well," she said, "just that." September arrived, and with it the first note from Jonathan Pierce that was not a threat, an excuse, or a negotiation. It was brief 3 sentences formal addressed to Abigail through Alcott's office. He acknowledged having made false statements. He acknowledged that those statements had been provably incorrect. He did not apologize exactly, but he withdrew the claims formally, and in writing, which was what she had asked for, and was from Jonathan Pierce, the most honest thing he had probably written in years. Alcott sent her a copy with a note that said simply, "As agreed. It is done." She read it at the breakfast table and set it beside her plate, and continued eating. Her father glanced at it and looked at her and said nothing. Her mother refilled the coffee. That was the end of Jonathan Pierce in Abigail Carter's life. Not a dramatic ending, not a confrontation or a scene or a final reckoning delivered in front of witnesses. Just a piece of paper in Alcott's careful handwriting, and a morning that continued on its ordinary business, and a woman who had decided that the conclusion of one story was simply the beginning of the space where another one could grow. Nathaniel knew about the letter before he arrived on Tuesday. Alcott had told him. He came in and sat down and said, "How do you feel?" "Finished," she said. "In the good way. The way a room feels when you've cleaned it thoroughly and put everything where it belongs." She looked at him. "Lighter." He nodded. "Good. And you?" she asked. "Relieved?" he said. "He's been a weight on this, on all of it." He set his hat on the table. "Now it's just us." She looked at him. Just us. 2 words, and they carried an entire future's worth of possibility inside them, quiet, unhurried, asking nothing she wasn't ready to give. "Just us," she agreed. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just the particular shift that happens when 2 people stop moving around something and start moving toward it. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. They sat in the Carter sitting room in the early September morning and talked about the land boundary question that Nathaniel had been working through with her father, and about whether the smaller Carter field in the north corner was better suited to a different crop rotation, and about a letter from Dorothea reporting that she was expecting her first child in the spring. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that people who are building something talk about, because what is being built is not made of declarations, but of ordinary days stacked carefully beside each other. When he stood to leave, he did not move toward the door immediately. He stood for a moment with his hat in both hands and looked at her and said, "I've been in Virginia for 2 months." "I know," she said. "My business in Lexington has been patient," he said. "It won't be patient much longer." She held very still. "I'll need to go back," he said. Not immediately, but within the month. He looked at her. I want you to know that before we go any further. I want you to have the full picture the way you said you needed. How long would you be gone? She asked. 6 to 8 weeks, he said. There are things in Kentucky that need my actual presence. The boundary dispute, a harvest, winter preparation. He paused. I'd come back. Would you? She said. Not a challenge, a question. Yes, he said. Simply, entirely. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she had learned in the past 8 weeks about herself, about what she needed, about the difference between what she had settled for and what she was actually capable of choosing. She thought about a man who had driven to the Whitmore estate on the basis of information and principle, and the conviction that she shouldn't have to stand alone, and who had then, across 8 weeks of Thursdays and Tuesdays and a Saturday morning on horseback, shown her without drama or performance every single thing he was. She thought about the word honest, about how she had told him she wanted to find out honestly at the right pace, about how the right pace was not always the comfortable one, about how sometimes honesty required you to name a thing before you felt entirely ready to name it, because the alternative was letting it wait so long that the waiting became its own kind of answer. Before you go, she said carefully, I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. He went still. All right, I am not going to tell you I'm in love with you, she said. Because I told you I wouldn't say things I wasn't sure of, and I intend to keep that. But I want you to know. She stopped, found the right words. I want you to know that 6 weeks ago, the thought of you leaving for 2 months would have been something I could have processed as a practical inconvenience and little else. And the fact that it is not that, now the fact that it is considerably more than that, is something I think you deserve to know before you go. Nathaniel stood very still. That's the honest version, she said. That's the honest version, he agreed, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something that was underneath the steadiness, that the steadiness was actually, she realized, working to contain. Good, she said. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time with that clear, direct look, the one that asked nothing of her and offered everything, and then he said quietly, I'll be back before the leaves are gone. She nodded. Once. He went. The carriage moved down the drive. The September morning continued around her, and Abigail Carter stood in the doorway of her family home and watched it go, and felt something she could not yet call by its right name, but which moved through her chest like water, finding its level, certain and quiet, and exactly precisely where it was supposed to be. He said before the leaves were gone. He came back when there were still a few left on the oaks, just barely, just enough to make the promise technically kept. And Abigail heard the carriage on the drive on a Tuesday morning in late October, and did not run to the window because she was a composed woman who had learned a great deal about the value of composure. She walked to the window. That was different from running. He looked road-worn. 6 weeks of Kentucky and hard travel showed in the set of his shoulders when he stepped down from the carriage, in the dust on his coat, in the fact that he had not stopped to change before coming here, which she registered and filed away without comment. Clara opened the door before he had a chance to knock. Mr. Hawthorne, Clara said, in the voice she reserved for people who had earned a genuine welcome. Ma'am, he said, and came in. Abigail was in the sitting-room doorway when he turned. He looked at her across the entrance hall, and neither of them said anything for a moment. 6 weeks was not a long time. It had felt longer than it was in the particular way that time moves when something is unresolved and waiting. You made it before the leaves, she said. Just, he said. Come in, she said. You look like you need coffee. He came in and sat down, and Clara brought coffee without being asked, which was its own kind of statement. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her across the table with the clarity of a man who has had 6 weeks to think and has arrived at the end of the thinking. The boundary dispute is settled, he said. The harvest is in. The winter preparation is done. He set the cup down. I have no remaining obligations in Kentucky that require my immediate physical presence. She looked at him. That sounds like a preamble. It is, he said. I spent 6 weeks in Lexington thinking about this exact conversation and how to have it without either overstating or understating, and I've arrived at the conclusion that the only way to have it correctly is to simply have it. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to ask permission to speak with your father. Today, if he's available. Abigail's hands were very still in her lap. About what specifically? She said. About whether he would consider a formal arrangement, Nathaniel said. Between our families. Between us. He paused. I'm not asking you to say yes to anything today. I'm asking permission to begin the conversation with your father that would make it possible for you to say yes when and if you're ready. He held her gaze. Those are two entirely different things, and I want to be precise about which one I'm asking for. She thought about what she had said to him before he left the honest version she had called it. The fact that his leaving had become considerably more than a practical inconvenience. She thought about 6 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday mornings that had simply been ordinary mornings with a quality of absence she had not fully accounted for until it arrived. He's in the North Field, she said. He usually comes in at noon. I'll wait, Nathaniel said. I know you will, she said. They sat together in the sitting room for the better part of an hour and talked about Kentucky, about the boundary settlement, about the land there, about the differences between Virginia farming and Kentucky farming, that Nathaniel had opinions about, and that she questioned with enough precision to make him revise 2 of them. It was ordinary conversation. It was also not ordinary at all, because it had underneath it the particular quality of 2 people who have agreed that something is coming and are moving toward it with the shared understanding that they are moving toward it together. Robert Carter came in from the North Field at 10 minutes past noon, stopped in the entrance hall when he saw the extra coat on the hook, and came to the sitting room doorway with the expression of a man who has put together several pieces of available information and reached an accurate conclusion. Mr. Hawthorne, he said. When did you get back? This morning, Nathaniel said and stood. Robert Carter looked at his daughter. She gave him nothing, not confirmation, not deflection. Just her face, which he had been reading for 22 years, and which was she knew perfectly legible to him. Come to the study, her father said to Nathaniel. I'll have Clara bring something. They were in the study for 40 minutes. Abigail did not hover near the door. She went back to the writing desk and did her accounts, which required sufficient concentration to occupy the functional part of her mind, while the rest of it did whatever it was going to do. Clara came through once refilled the coffee and said nothing. Her mother came down from upstairs, looked at her daughter, looked at the closed study door, and sat in the chair by the window, with her sewing with the particular composure of a woman who has decided that her part in this scene is to be present without being disruptive. The study door opened at 20 minutes past noon. Both men came out with the expressions of people who have reached an agreement, not identical expressions, because they were not identical men, but a matched quality of settled completion that communicated the same thing. Her father looked at her. He'd like to speak with you, he said, and then with the economy of a man who trusts his daughter completely, I'll be in the kitchen. He went. Margaret followed with the unhurried movement of a woman who understands that some rooms need to be emptied before they can be filled with something new. Nathaniel came and sat across from her. He did not produce anything theatrical. He did not kneel or make speeches or construct the elaborate apparatus of a proposal designed to be remembered as a performance. He simply sat across from her and looked at her the way he had always looked at her, like the answer actually mattered. Your father has agreed, he said, to consider a formal arrangement contingent on your own decision, which he said was the only decision that counted, and I told him I agreed with him. What did you tell him about your intentions? She asked. I told him I intended to make you a genuine partner in every sense of the word, in the management of land and decisions that affect both our families in the construction of whatever life we build. He paused. I told him that you were the most capable person I'd encountered in a decade of doing business with capable people, and that I had no interest in a marriage that required you to be smaller than you are. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very practical proposal, she said. Would you prefer a less practical one? He asked. No, she said. I very much would not. He looked at her. Abigail, I have been in love with you for 3 years. I said I'd be plain about things, and so I'm saying that plainly. I was in love with you when you turned me away, and I was in love with you when I drove to the Whitmore estate, and I was in love with you through 6 weeks in Kentucky, during which I thought about approximately nothing else with any consistency. He did not raise his voice, did not make it theatrical. He said it the way he said everything as a fact, being accurately reported. I'm asking you to marry me. Not because the circumstances recommend it, or because it's practical, or because of anything other than the fact that I want to spend the rest of my life in rooms where you are. Abigail was quiet. She thought about the ring she had pressed back into Jonathan's hand. She thought about the ballroom and the practiced regret on a man's face, and the 100 people watching, and the particular discipline required to walk across that floor without letting it touch her. She thought about a carriage rolling up a dark drive and a man saying, "Are you all right?" as though the answer genuinely mattered. She thought about Alcott's office and Philadelphia bank records and a Saturday morning on horseback by the creek and 6 weeks of October that had been longer than they should have been. She thought about what she had told her mother, when no one is watching, he's exactly the same. Yes, she said. One word. No qualification, no condition, no measured addendum about pace or honesty, or what she was and wasn't sure of yet. Just yes, clear and entire, because she was sure not with the certainty of someone who has never been wrong before, but with the certainty of someone who has been wrong before and learned precisely what wrong feels like. And this was not that. He reached across the table and took her hand the first time in all the weeks they had been in this room together that he had reached for her without the pretext of practical assistance. His hand was warm and steady, and he held hers the way he did most things, without excess, without performance, with the simple certainty of a man who has wanted this specific thing for long enough that having it requires no announcement. "Thank you," he said. "You're going to stop thanking me eventually," she said. "Probably not," he said. And this time the smile was immediate and full, and she felt it in her own chest like something coming home. She went to the kitchen doorway and said, "Papa." Just that. Her father appeared. He looked at his daughter's face, and he did not need her to say anything further. He looked at Nathaniel, who was standing now, and something moved across Robert Carter's face, something that Abigail had only seen a handful of times in her life, and which she recognized as the particular expression of a man who is genuinely, undefendedly glad. "Well," her father said. And then to Nathaniel, "You'll stay for dinner." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said. "Thank you." Her mother came out of the kitchen with Clara directly behind her, and Clara was not pretending that she hadn't heard all of it, and her expression held the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she considered the correct outcome arrive at the correct time after a sufficient quantity of difficulty. The dinner was the best meal Abigail could remember eating in the Carter house, and not because of anything that was served. They were married in December. Not at a grand estate with 100 guests and crystal glasses, and an audience waiting to assess the spectacle. At the Carter house with the people who had actually been present through all of it. Her parents, Dorothea, and her husband, Thomas Alcott, and his wife, Clara, and the household staff, who had earned the right to be in the room. The ceremony was performed by a minister who kept it short and genuine, which was exactly what both of them had asked for. Nathaniel said his vows in the same voice he said everything, direct and unhurried and meaning every word. Abigail said hers, looking at him, not at the room, because the room was not the point, and had never been the point. When the minister pronounced them married, Nathaniel took her hand and held it, and the thing she felt was not the dizzy euphoria of performed romance. It was something better. It was solid. It was the feeling of two people who have looked at each other honestly and said, "Yes, this I choose this," and meant it without reservation. Clara cried quietly in the back of the room. She denied it afterward. They spent their first winter at the Carter lands, while the arrangements for the Hawthorne property in Kentucky were finalized, and that winter became one of the foundation stones of everything that followed long evenings with shared books and argued opinions. Mornings spent working through the land management decisions that Robert Carter was beginning with great care and obvious pleasure to hand off to his daughter and son-in-law. Nathaniel learned the Carter land the way he learned everything thoroughly, and without pretending he knew more than he did. Abigail learned the specific qualities of a man who was entirely comfortable with a woman who knew more than he did about her own domain, and who had no impulse whatsoever to perform expertise he didn't possess. They moved to Kentucky in the spring of 1819. The Hawthorne lands were larger than she had imagined, not in the way of someone who hadn't listened when the size was described, but in the way that numbers become real only when your feet are actually on the ground, and the ground goes on for what feels like longer than a number can adequately represent. It was good land, well managed. The people who worked it had been with the Hawthorne family long enough to have opinions about things, and Nathaniel had the particular quality of being the kind of employer who listened to those opinions, which meant the people who had them were intelligent enough to have good ones. Abigail arrived in Kentucky and got to work. Within 3 months, she had reorganized the household accounts into a system that was both more accurate and considerably faster to reconcile. Within 6 months, she had identified 2 areas of the crop rotation that were underperforming relative to the soil quality and had presented Nathaniel with a documented case for adjustment that he read once looked up at her from across the desk and said, "You're right, let's do it." No argument, no performative reluctance, no need to have arrived at the conclusion himself before he could accept it. Just "you're right, let's do it." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The idea for the school came from Abigail in the 2nd year of their marriage on a morning when she was reviewing the accounts, and Nathaniel was reading a letter from Alcott that contained, among other things, a brief mention of conditions in the county's poorer settlements, families who had land and the will to work it, but not the education to navigate the legal and financial machinery that increasingly governed what happened to that land. She set down her pen. She said, "There are children in this county who can't read." Nathaniel looked up from the letter. "A fair number of them, yes." "That's going to determine the rest of their lives," she said. "Not their character, not their capacity, just whether they had access to something that was available to us because of what family we were born into." He looked at her for a moment. He could see where this was going, and the expression on his face was not resistance. It was the particular expression of a man who has already arrived at the same conclusion and was waiting for someone to say it out loud. "How many children are we talking about?" he said. "In the immediate area, I don't know exactly. I'd need to find out." She looked at him. "I'd like to find out." "Then let's find out," he said. The school opened in a converted outbuilding on the Hawthorne property in the autumn of 1820, with 14 children enrolled and a teacher named Mrs. Caldwell, who was 43 years old and had been teaching other people's children in her own kitchen for years, and was spectacularly relieved to have a proper room and a proper salary. Abigail ran the administration. Nathaniel provided the building the salary and a substantial credibility among the surrounding land-owning families, whose support they needed to make the thing sustainable. It grew. By 1822, there were 26 children. By 1824, they had built a proper schoolhouse. Other families in the county began contributing, not because Nathaniel and Abigail asked for social recognition, but because the results of the school were visible in the children who had gone through it, and visible results are the most persuasive argument there is. Their first child, a daughter, was born in the spring of 1820. They named her Eleanor after no one in particular because they liked the name and saw no reason to saddle a child with the weight of an ancestor's memory when she was perfectly capable of making her own. Eleanor arrived into a household where both her parents worked, argued, laughed, read, and demonstrated daily that the management of a shared life required the same things as the management of a shared property: honesty, precision, respect, and the willingness to say when you were wrong. A son followed 2 years later. Then another daughter. The Hawthorne household expanded and adjusted and remained throughout a place where people said what they meant and meant what they said, and where the children grew up believing this was simply how houses worked, which was perhaps the best inheritance anyone could leave them. Jonathan Pierce's name came up once in 1821, when Dorothea wrote from Virginia with a letter that mentioned almost in passing that he had left Richmond the previous year under circumstances that involved at least 2 of his creditors and a particularly unflattering court document. He had gone to Georgia. Dorothea understood where no one knew him well enough yet to have opinions. Abigail read the letter and thought about the ballroom in 1818 and the practiced regret on a man's face, and felt nothing she needed to examine closely. Not satisfaction, not pity. Just the mild, distant recognition of a chapter that had closed entirely. She folded Dorothea's letter, set it aside, and went back to the school enrollment figures she had been reviewing. It was a Tuesday morning in October of 1823 when Nathaniel found her on the back porch of the Hawthorne house, standing with a cup of coffee, looking out at the fields where the harvest was coming in, and the children were visible in the distance. Eleanor and her younger brother chasing each other through the stubble, while 2 of the field hands watched with the amused tolerance of people who have seen children do exactly this for 20 years and find it reliably entertaining. He came and stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He had always known when silence was the right answer, and he still knew. After a while, she said, "Do you remember the carriage?" He knew which carriage. "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "About what I thought it was that night. I thought it was rescue. I thought you had come to provide an exit." She looked out at the fields. "But that's not what it was." "No," he agreed. "It was just a door left open," she said. "That's all. You left a door open and let me decide whether to walk through it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were always going to walk through it." She looked at him. "Not because of me," he said. "Because of you. Because you're the kind of person who—" He stopped, found the precise words because he was always precise when it mattered. "Because you don't stay in rooms that are wrong for you. It might take you a minute to recognize the room, but once you do, you leave." He looked at her directly. "I just made sure there was somewhere to go." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had waited, without demanding who had come back, without reclaiming, who had built a life beside her, rather than in front of her, or behind her, who said true things simply and difficult things plainly, and never once required her to be smaller than she was. She reached over and took his hand. He held it the same way he always had, warm, steady, without excess. "Thank you," she said, "for the door." "Thank you," he said, "for walking through it." The children were still running in the field below. Eleanor was faster than her brother, which she demonstrated without mercy, and he accepted with the cheerful resilience of a child who has never been given reason to believe that losing a foot race determines anything important about a person's worth. The harvest was coming in clean. The sky was the particular blue of late October in Kentucky, clear and deep and going gold at the edges where the afternoon was starting to turn. Abigail Hawthorne held her husband's hand on the back porch of a house that was entirely hers on land she understood, and had helped to build into something worth building, beside a man who had loved her honestly, and waited patiently, and asked for nothing. She hadn't freely given, and she thought about the girl who had stood on the Whitmore steps in the August heat of 1818, with a bare ring finger and a straight spine, and the absolute refusal to let anyone see her break. That girl had walked off those steps and into a carriage, and into a life that was nothing like the one she had planned, and considerably better than anything she had known to want. She thought about what she would tell Eleanor someday, not as a lesson, because lessons delivered as lessons rarely land, but in the way that mothers tell daughters true things in passing, as though they are simply observations about the world, rather than the most important things they know. She would tell her a man who asks nothing of you except that you be honest. That is the rarest thing. Do not dismiss it because it doesn't arrive the way you expect. Do not mistake quietness for absence, or steadiness for blandness, or patience for indifference. The ones who perform loudest often have the least behind the performance. The ones who simply show up on the right night at the right door without drama or demand, those are the ones worth watching. She would tell her, choose the thing that asks you to be more of yourself, not less. She would tell her the carriage is not the rescue. You are the rescue. The carriage is just the door. The children came running up from the field, loud and breathless and muddy at the knees, And Eleanor grabbed her mother's free hand without ceremony, and her brother grabbed his father's, and the four of them stood on the back porch of the Hawthorne house in the October afternoon, while the harvest came in around them, and the day turned steadily and quietly toward evening. This was the life. Not the dramatic version, not the performance of happiness that required an audience and 100 crystal glasses. The actual version. The one built from honest words and patient years, and two people who had chosen each other freely without rescue and without surrender, and kept choosing each other in the 10,000 ordinary moments that made up every day of every year that followed. This was what real love looked like when you finally stopped mistaking the performance for the thing itself. It looked like a man who came back before the leaves were gone because he had said he would. It looked like a woman who said yes with her whole chest and no qualifications. It looked like a school with 26 children in it, and a field coming in clean, and a daughter who was faster than anyone gave her credit for, and a house where everyone said what they meant. It looked like this, exactly like this, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.